fire marshals. So there was at one point 351 marshals, probably less back in the late 1800s. But the state fire marshal in Boston ultimately becomes the Boston fire marshal ultimately becomes the state fire marshal. So that's kind of the theme of the book. But what I wanted to talk with you guys tonight about is I found 10 case studies, and we're not going to go through all 10 tonight, but this is what the book is based on. And we're going to go through and look at historic incidents that involve the fire department. So fires, explosions, large loss fires, those kinds of things. I didn't bother focusing on some of those cases that you would be familiar with already, but that's all right. That's all right. I'm good. We're going to fake it till we make it. We're good. Okay. That's important. Thank you. I got to change that.
All right. Maybe it's.
Is that mine? Is that what this going on? I'm going to. Sorry, we're just having some technical problems here. Where's that? How did you do that?
That's all right. Now I got it to work. There we go.
Let me just stick here. All right, I'm going to stick with that.
This does work. It's up
Okay.
to you.
Awesome.
If you just leave that right in the bottom drawer, it'd be great.
Thank you, Lori. Appreciate it. And we're back. Thanks. So what I want to talk about is the Office of the State Fire Marshal. And the book also deals with the history of the State Fire Academy, which was started in 1966. We're not going to get too much into that tonight, but if you're interested in the history of the Fire Academy, began in Framingham and then moved to Stowe, got hit with the arson fires in 1982. Fascinating story. I got a lot of original photos in the book, so when that comes out. And what I was referring to earlier was the historic events. So in the book, I'm profiled the Preble box stove fire in Lynn, Mass. That was November 8, 1928. We're going to look at the St. John's School fire in 1915, and that'll be our first case study tonight. And then I go to the Symphony Road arson fires that began in the late 70s into the early 80s, and that involved a Mass State Trooper who was conducting the investigation, was actually involved in starting the arson fires. From there, we're going to talk about tonight the origins of the state hazmat team. Began in Somerville in 1980. The book also gets into the boiler explosions, which were common, prevalent in the late 1800 or late 19th century into the early 20th century. It was like every other day, a boiler was exploding and killing many people. We're going to talk about, I think we'll be able to get to tonight, the origins of the Fire Investigation Unit, the bomb squad, and the first state police chemist, Walter Libby Wedger, fascinating guy. From there, we can talk about the Merrimack Street mattress factory fire. That was in 1898, killed 6 Boston firefighters. From there, I want to talk about the 1922 wildfires in the state wildfire history in Massachusetts. I know 2024 was a busy year in wildland fires in Massachusetts. 1922 was 10 times more impactful. And then we'll talk about, we probably won't have time to talk about the history of fireworks in the Commonwealth, but it's a fascinating story. And then finally, the book winds up with the Tremont Street subway gas explosion in Boston in 1898. So the book covers a lot. We'll see how much we get through tonight. I'm going to end towards the top of the hour, towards 7 o'clock. If anyone has any questions, I'll definitely make sure we leave time to talk. Essentially, those cases are based around different occupancies. There's industrial settings. So when we talk about the Preble toe box factory, an explosion due to chemicals, the origins of the hazmat I mentioned. These are just the different ways that that I broke up the different cases. And the way I organize these cases in order to stay consistent, I use this FIRE format. So I look at the facts, the impacts, the response, and then the evolution. What I really want to demonstrate as we go is each of these incidents led to some progress. So bad things happened, we arrived, there were lessons learned, and mostly driven through the state fire marshal's office, changes occurred. And that's the underlying theme throughout this whole thing. Something happened, we responded, we mitigated it, and then we learned from there to make changes. And that's the real important thing here. So the first case I want to talk about tonight is the St. John's School fire. I mentioned it. It was Peabody, Mass., October 28, 1915. Horrible story. Peabody is, of course, an old mill town, like many towns in Massachusetts. St. John's School fire, it was one of the deadliest school fires in Massachusetts history, certainly. Top 5 around the rest of the country. 21 students were killed, all schoolgirls. This was a Catholic school. The school itself, it's a 3-story brick structure. You can see it on the right. It turns out there's not many photos of this fire. There's only a handful. I could only get my hands on about 8 of them. This tragedy triggered a lot of people for 1915, and the mayor of Peabody wanted to keep this to a minimum, didn't want the word getting out. This turns out to be a national event. Obviously, you get 21 schoolgirls dying in a tragic fire. It's going to make the news, and it stayed in the news nationally for a long time. The building here on the right, you can see it had recently gone under some modernization, so it was restored, or renovated rather, but even for 1915, it lacked a lot of the key infrastructures that we take for granted today, things like alarm systems and sprinklers. So in terms of the origin and cause of the fire, it was determined later on that the fire started in the basement under the main stairway. There was a wood barrel under the main stairway, and it turns out that there was a barrel with flammable materials in there, likely paper debris, that kind of thing. Investigators, when they first arrived, there was so much damage that they, at the time, thought that it was, of course, a boiler explosion. I referenced earlier on, that would have been the most common thing to think of, that there was a boiler explosion and then caused the fire, and that led to all of these fatalities. That was ruled out pretty quickly, and we'll talk about the investigation that went on and who conducted the investigation. The key fire hazards were determined to be a wooden stairway. The building was set up with when you first walk in the main door, there's a large wooden stairway without any enclosures. So the wooden stairway and the hallways acted as a chimney, and that allowed the fire to spread rapidly throughout the structure. No fireproof doors, no enclosed stairwells in the building, and that allowed the flames to rapidly move throughout the structure. Also, and arguably more importantly, the school had procedures for fire drills. It was a Catholic school. Nuns taught many of the classes, if not all, and they did practice fire drills. So when the alarm sounded, students stood up, lined up in the hall, a nun at the front, and they were all directed per their protocol in the fire drill to walk towards the main stairway, all convene and walk down in an organized fashion down that main stairway out the front door. So unfortunately, the school's fire drill system failed, and that's where a lot of the fatalities came from. So it's this the rapid spread and the lack of adaptable evacuation plans resulted in the high number of fire casualties. So in terms of the death toll, I mentioned there were 21 students. A majority of them were from smoke inhalation, but many of them succumbed to severe burns. And then the rest were killed as a result of crushing injuries. So there was this bottleneck on the stairs. They were unable to all exit in an orderly fashion as they had practiced, and they became trampled. In terms of the survivors and the injuries, when the Peabody Fire Department arrived, there was heavy smoke and fire from all sides of the building. Many students were jumping as they were first arriving, jumping from the second stories, and many of the injuries, not fatalities, but many of the injuries were secondary to leaping out of the second story building. And a lot of the town people at that point had become aware of the fire, and they were trying to assist with rescues, but they were unable because of the heavy smoke and fire. It turned out that, like many small communities at this time, many of the parents of the students were firefighters in that neighborhood. So they arrived, they had just earlier that morning dropped their kids off, and one of the firefighters from Peabody, John Ellis, who was off duty, had walked his three daughters to school that morning. He heard the commotion, ran back, and ended up rescuing not only his three daughters, but multiple other rescues during this fire as well. And there were just, as I read through the newspaper accounts, there were so many stories like this with just the neighbors rushing into the flames and smoke and trying to do rescues, and they were just constantly pushed back. It was just a tremendous loss, and it was felt throughout the community for a long time. This quickly became a national event, so it was picked up by the national newspapers, and it stayed in the newspapers for quite some time. In terms of the response, the firefighting response, they arrived quick. Peabody Fire did. Mutual aid came from Salem and Marblehead initially, other departments later on. They did their best to make fire. They were throwing ladders, but they were quickly pushed back. The brick structure and all the wood inside, it was difficult to make entry and do rescues by the time they arrived and set up. In terms of the investigation, and this is where the State Fire Marshal's office comes in. We don't have time to get into the back and forth tonight about in terms of who was running the Fire Marshal's office, but initially I mentioned the first State Fire Marshal was initially the City of Boston Fire Marshal, Charles Whitcomb. It became very political. Eventually he was ousted, and he was replaced by a Mass State Police Detective Lieutenant. George C. Neal was a deputy chief with the Metropolitan District Police, which ultimately became the Mass State Police. Marshal Neal, rather, excuse me, ends up staying in that position for more than 35 years in his career. So this is in 1915. He's about halfway through his career. He's very politically savvy. He's an investigator. He understands that when he first arrived that this is bad, and it's going to be bad. Immediately they recognize large loss, many fatalities, and he quickly calls in mutual aid from other outside the state to get objective opinions on cause and origin of the fire, and tries to bypass a lot of the politics that he's anticipating and end up coming up as a result of this fire, primarily because of the schoolgirls that are involved in it. So they quickly determined where the cause and origin underneath the stairs, and it was in a barrel. They never determined what the ignition source was, but they also determined that it wasn't a boiler. The investigation quickly identified these other key issues as the major safety failures, essentially those things I mentioned. So when the renovations were conducted, there were no automatic fire alarms. there were no sprinkler systems. They didn't have any fireproof doors and no stairway enclosures. And then the exits were blocked, and that led to all those crushing injuries. So essentially, this fire exposed the major deficiencies in school, fire, safety codes, and evacuation planning. And what changes came up as a result of this? This went on, this was front page news for months and months on the national front. Every time there was a report released by the fire marshal's office, it made national news, obviously because of the large loss of children in this particular case. So a couple things came up pretty quickly as a result of this. There were stronger school fire safety regulations. The fire marshal immediately, as the investigation came out, made mandatory installation of automatic fire alarms in all schools, not retroactively, but going forward. So any new school building in Massachusetts needed to have automatic fire alarms in all schools. He also enacted code to say that all school buildings in Massachusetts had to be sprinklered, at least in the basement. So this obviously evolves, but this was a pivotal moment because up until that point, there were no codes mandating any sprinkler systems in the building. So all school buildings retroactively had to have sprinkler systems put in the basement at the very least. And then finally, third, the stairways had to be enclosed with fireproof materials to prevent that fire spread. Again, that was not retroactive, but that was going forward. Those are some major changes. Obviously, it cost a lot of money to make those changes going forward, but he had a lot of political sway and used it to make the legislature enact these codes. Not easy to do, a lot of back and forth. So in terms of the fire drills and the emergency preparedness, one of the things that came up as a result of this, again, the school teachers, in this case, they happened to be nuns, they were directed to line the students up and move them down a predetermined path. They were enacted or empowered after this to make decisions based on what was actually going on in the building. So they were told that you could, is that me? They were told that as a result of this fire, that they had, they didn't call them this, but I ended up interpreting it as like hall bosses. So when a fire drill occurred, the hall bosses would go out and take a look around and see what was actually going on. If they had clear passage down their primary exit route, they could follow it. If they, in fact, had their primary exit route was blocked, the hall boss would direct the teachers to a secondary egress method. And that was an important change that was made. I mentioned the school building code reforms. Flammable materials in the storage areas were banned, and they were part of an inspection that went on a routine basis. Up till that point, wooden barrels were used for refuse, and the code changed to mandate that metal containers had to be used for storing debris. Seems intuitive nowadays, but at the time, that's what they had. And then finally, the fireproof stairwells and these self-closing doors became standard. In terms of the public awareness and national impact, these Massachusetts reforms, they influenced codes for schools around the country. So it started here in Massachusetts, but they were quickly adopted state by state, first in New England, then out towards the Midwest, and then eventually around the rest of the country in different degrees, different versions. But state fire marshals recognized this around the country, that this was, they didn't want to be dealing with this in their communities, so they quickly adopted these approaches. So just in summary, the key takeaways, excuse me, students were trained to evacuate in a rigid and ineffective manner that failed in a real world emergency. The building design flaws we talked about, and this disaster led to landmark reforms, including fire alarms, enclosed stairwells, and adaptive fire drills that saved lives in future fires. And that's one of the few pictures that we have of that particular structure. I was going to move on. Do we have any questions? Any questions online about St. John's School fire? We can come back if you want to later. All right, next case study. The Somerville hazmat incident. This is April 4th, 1980. This is the origin story of the state hazmat team. I was talking to the guys here in District 5 hazmat. We don't have time to get into it tonight, but in the book I talk about all the politics that came as a result of this initial incident. But this was Somerville, April of 1980. Previous to this, there was no hazmat team. Every department handled it differently. This changed the game. All right, so in terms of the initial incident, April 4, 1980, this is a rail yard in Somerville, Mass, right outside Boston, kind of contiguous part of Boston, if you will. It's a tanker car carrying 13,000 gallons of phosphorus trichloride. The tanker car was stationary. This becomes important later on. And the tanker car was struck at a relatively low speed by a diesel locomotive that was moving rail cars around the B&M rail yard. So relatively slow speed accident. The tanker is ruptured as a result of this relatively low speed collision, and it releases this phosphorus trichloride out the bottom, and as soon as it hits the air and starts to pool, it turns into fumes. All right, phosphorus trichloride, I'm not a hazmat tech, but it does react violently with water, and it produces hydrochloric acid, and phosphoric acid vapors. So that quickly begins to dissipate and create a plume all around Somerville and a good portion of Cambridge also. Now this is during the week, during the day. Late in the morning, I want to say around 10 a.m. So kids are already in school, people are already at work, and Somerville's buzzing along as it would. Immediately, people begin to complain of irritation, respiratory, burning skin, burning eyes, etc. This is widespread and very rapidly. In terms of the community vulnerability, this is a very densely populated area. There are residences, schools, and businesses all around the rail yard. So it's immediate, and it begins to spread across a larger swath of area very quickly. At that time, this is 1980, there are no emergency notification systems that existed for hazmat specifically. So there were some level of emergency broadcasting systems. If you remember, if you're of a certain age, you'll remember being interrupted by the emergency broadcasting systems. But activating those, getting into those systems from the local level was not very practical. It wasn't the kind of thing that you could do any short term. It took a long process to get involved in that system. So immediately, the impact, there were consequences and casualties right away, or causalities, not casualties, causalities, excuse me. In terms of the mass evacuations and disruptions, 16,000 people were evacuated from Somerville and parts of Cambridge. Large swath of area. If you're familiar with the region, Route 93 goes right through the middle of this. Route 93 was shut down, and traffic was diverted, creating a whole separate nightmare on its own. Traffic being sent into neighborhoods they weren't familiar with, people didn't know where they were, and the air was already irritating respiratory and eyes. So people were panicking, essentially. The local businesses and schools were forced to close without a whole lot of information. It wasn't handled systematically. Some businesses tried to stay open. Some schools tried to keep students in place. Others evacuated and wanted to send them home. Parents tried to show up at schools and found out their kids were sent home. It was just mayhem. It was just complete chaos during this initial stage. Medical emergencies and exposures was probably the biggest issue. 400 people presented themselves at the hospital by themselves, so they self-presented. And again, similar levels of complaint: respiratory distress, skin irritation, burning eyes, etc. Firefighters obviously arrived early. They were not equipped to deal with this, and this is one of the big changes that comes up as a result of this. They weren't trained and they weren't equipped. They were showing up with their turnout gear, and they did have SCBA at the time, but it was leaving them all exposed and contaminating their gear. Not to mention, they didn't understand how to deal with this. They were unaware that this hazard was in their community, and they were trying to figure this out as they went. They didn't have a relationship with the rail company. The rail company was very defensive and didn't want to share information. So that was probably one of the bigger issues that they had to overcome early on. At several hours into this, the city of Somerville essentially self-evacuated, and it felt like a ghost town from what they described. There was a lot of political pushback early on. The mayor, Eugene Bruin, he was not happy, and he made it clear that he was not happy with the way the initial incident went on. He was surprised that this was a hazard in the center of his town. This is not something that they ever considered, and he was on the news. He was talking in the newspapers. He was outraged, and that just fueled the political outrage in turn. There was a lot of public fear that what the long-term outcomes of this exposure were, and not only health-wise, but in terms of the local economy also. It was very unclear early on when this was going to be resolved and when life could get back to normal. So there was a lot of pushback, a lot of confusion, and the fire department ended up mitigating this, but it took a lot of improvisation early on. So in terms of their emergency response actions, the fire departments, they did get together, they organized, and they tried to come up with a plan to contain the spill. But it was relatively slow. It leaked for some time. Ultimately, what they did was they brought in a DPW front-end loader with sand from a dump truck, and they covered it up. There was still a plume, a residue in the air that lasted for days. At the time, the closest thing that they had in terms of a statewide mutual aid plan, there was a metropolitan Boston fire control plan that they did activate. It was essentially designed around structure fires, but they did activate that. And that brought in some mutual aid and got the chiefs thinking about longer term operations. So the confusion and the delays and identifying the chemical in the early stages is probably the most frustrating issue that they had to deal with early on. They didn't have the information. They didn't have the ERGs that we have today. They didn't have the relationships or the communications with Chemtrec, with the rail company. The investigation relatively early on yielded a funny loophole that I called your attention to earlier. The tanker that was ruptured was stationary. The locomotive was moving. The locomotive struck the tanker. According to federal law at that time, if the tanker wasn't moving, it wasn't under federal jurisdiction. It wasn't the state and the city wasn't aware of it, but it wasn't the Fed's problem because it wasn't moving. That's what the Feds came back and said, not our problem. The tanker wasn't moving, the locomotive was moving, and so that created this loophole. In terms of operations, it really made no difference, but that's what came out as a result of the changes that needed to be made around here. And it went back and forth for some time, long into the, after this was resolved, of course, but that was an interesting loophole. I don't think anyone planned on it being something that would get them out of trouble. That was just the way the regulations were written. So in the rail yard in the middle of the city, if the tanker was stationary, they weren't paying attention to it. A lot of changes came up as a result of this one. So there was, the state developed this hazmat emergency planning committee, and from the get-go, they recognized that this needed to be a statewide plan. All right, so this was a region or a local incident, but when the state fire marshal got involved with it, he recognized that this planning needed to happen statewide. So there was a lot of planning that went on with it, and very quickly, the fire academy took point on this and began training with hazmat training. A lot of money was thrown at this in terms of equipment and supplies. The state was divided at this point, hadn't been so, into 15 at the time, 15 different hazmat regions. And initially firefighters, and it becomes an issue early on, career versus volunteer, no call, but volunteer firefighters at that time had to undergo 24 hours, a whole 24 hours of hazmat specific training. There was a lot of politicking back and forth in terms of who could go through this training. Could it be career? Could it be volunteer? And out here in the Berkshires, obviously at that time, there weren't many career fire departments out here. They recognized that the rail system came out this way. Someone needed to do it. Long story short, the volunteers were allowed at that point to participate in this. The feds, to their credit, they did get involved with the state and partnered up with the DOT, the Federal Department of Transportation, and they recognized this as a watershed moment and that changes needed to be made, not only at the state level, but at the federal level as well. So there was technology changes that were made at the rail yard in terms of couplers and the way the tanker cars were reinforced to reduce the possibility of ruptures in the future. So there were some lessons learned at all levels here. But really at the state level, it was this, besides the hazmat team, this creation of an interagency notification system came out as a result of this. So not only between police departments and chief elected officials and fire departments, but also connecting up with the state and the rail yard companies. They're a private entity. And this incident began to open up a line of communication between them that ultimately became positive. So there were some good evolutions. There was some progress made as a result of this. So I mentioned there was a single train accident resulted in the toxic fumes. A lot of confusion and delays early on. We did get some positive change as a result of this. And Massachusetts became the only state in the country at that time to have this statewide response to hazmat incidents. All right, I'll come back to this if anyone has any questions. Let me move on to our next case. Okay, the 1922 wildfire incident. I don't think the fire marshal's on, but if he is, he'll know that last year in 2024, the marshal and probably more the Jake, the state public information officer, I heard a lot of use of the word unprecedented for 2024. And it was a busy wildfire season, without a doubt. But it pales in comparison to 1922. And I did text the marshal on more than one occasion, asked him if he remembered 1922 and the wildfire incident. All kidding. But 1922 was an interesting time in the state's wildfire history. Now, it gets beyond the state of Massachusetts, but because this was essentially a New England phenomenon at this particular time, and also much worse up into Canada. So, you know, obviously the wildfires don't observe state lines, but Massachusetts and other states in New England and Canada were heavily impacted by this 1922 wildfire season. I got to back up to 1921. There was an ice storm that in late 1921, December, that brought down a lot of trees. A lot of debris came down. There were electrical outlet blackouts at the time. Not all communities in Massachusetts had electrical power, but those that did were without power for weeks at a time until they can make that repair. Very cold December in 1921 brought down a lot of trees. When, at the beginning of 1922, as the snow melted, we ran into a drought right away. So there was immediately, by March, it was determined that there was a drought, March of 1922. there was already a lot of woody debris on the ground. And so, it set the stage. There was a lot of woody debris and drought, and it was just waiting to happen. And sure enough, by March of 1922, the fires had started and then continued throughout. At this point, the State Fire Marshal's office wasn't as involved as it would be today. This was more a state forestry effort, and there was back and forth. So at that point, what is today DCR was the Department of Conservation. And Department of Conservation at this point ran wildlife management, and the State Fire Marshal's office played a support role. But given that these were outside of urban areas, the State Fire Marshal essentially had hands off. The responsibility for many of these fires was determined to be railway breaks, sparks, causing, initiating fires, and also from motor vehicles, not from the motor vehicles themselves, but at this time in 1922, automobiles, cars were relatively new, and people would leave the cities in their brand new cars, and smoking cigarettes was big at that time. So everyone smoked cigarettes. They would take rides out into the country, and like everyone else at that point, they would get done with their cigarette, and they would toss them out their window, and that was just what they did at the time. The cause of those fires was attributed to either sparks from rail or smokers. And the Department of Conservation very quickly developed what we would determine a PIO message out. Do not do this out to the general public. So beginning in April and all the way through May of 1922, this was the peak fire period. Again, this is in Massachusetts specifically, but all over the region, there were a tremendous number of fires. So in just 1 week, the week of April 24, there were over 1,000 wildfires in Massachusetts. Right? And going into the first week of May, there were another 875 fires that broke out in the first 2 weeks around Massachusetts. The major fires, they caused extensive devastation. Just a couple interesting factoids. April 28th, there's, in May 2, there was, the fires reported, there were, in every region across Massachusetts, there was a major wildfire going on. In Medfield, a fire was caused by the railroad, and that resulted in 1,500 acres of burned land out around and inside the town of Medfield. Fire departments were overwhelmed, and they stayed overwhelmed. At this point, the Mass State Police gets involved, and they are just assisting at this point, doing what they can do to get this done. At the end of the 1922 wildfire season, there were a total of 4,100 fires. More than 85,000 acres were burned. $500,000 in 1922 dollars, and 122 buildings destroyed. 5 fatalities were involved in fighting these fires during this period. Just to put things in perspective, this was the 2024 numbers. You can see here 4,100 fires versus 1,285 fires, and there's your acreage, 85,000 versus 4,500 acres. So you can see they were just vastly different. It was just a different sort of situation. The response to the fires, there was a lot of public pushback. People were essentially determined to be the cause here. And it was determined that the commissioner at the time for the Department of Conservation really was quite vocal and pushed back on motorists and smokers in particular. And there was a large media campaign, the best they can do at the time, mostly in the newspapers, reminding people to not do this. But also what this did was it created this new focus on fire prevention laws and brought the Department of Conservation and the State Fire Marshal closer together to work on these issues. This was an initiative that led to a lot of prevention, a lot of debris management, what we call an emergency management today, debris management. So when trees came down, it was essential that we clean them up so they didn't provide this fuel. This was also a key moment in development of these fire towers, this network of fire towers that we still have today and count on today. At this point in 1922, at the end of this fire season, there were 39 fire towers put up. And they had different ways to communicate with one another. It wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today, but essentially what they did was they had rangers up in the towers with binoculars, probably much like we do today. And there were also a series of legislations that went through to empower these rangers to make recommendations on recognizing hazards before they developed and forcing change, forcing mitigation of hazards. So that was a pretty key difference. So I mentioned we went from waiting until fires happen to being proactive and mitigating these hazards ahead of time. The state also pushed back on the railroad industry and forced them to do maintenance on what ended up being a lot of the brakes. When they would have brakes lock up, they would create sparks. So there was this inspection program that was driven by a lot of this particular fire. They also went through and did logging operations like in proximity to the rail and made sure that there was some clearances that weren't there before. Prior to this event, rail cars were in close proximity to the forest. The forest was allowed to grow right up into the side of the trains, and that was also part of the cause of the fire. There was also a fire prevention education program targeting motorists and farmers and factory workers, trying them to change their behavior. And then finally, as a result of this, the state did begin to work closer with the Department of Conservation, and they began to purchase equipment that was dedicated to wildland forest fighting. Prior to that, they didn't have any dedicated apparatus that was specifically focused on wildland fires. So those are a few of the key takeaways there. There you can see one of the William Baisley. He was the commissioner of Department of Conservation at the time, and he was a loud advocate of public information and changing behavior at in the public. Let me get through one more, and I will leave time before the top of the hour to get to some questions. The Merrimack Street mattress factory fire in Boston. 6 firefighters lost. This was February 5, 1898. Really a tragedy. In terms of the building, the cause of the fire, it likely started on the upper floors. It's hard to see in this photo. This is a clipping from the Boston Globe, but this is a mansard roof on top, so it's a flat roof. This is in February. It was a very cold day, and there had been a lot of snow. There was a warm spell, so there was a lot of water accumulated already on the roof of this structure. Arriving companies started to lob water, throw ladders, as you can see, and the water load on top of the ice and water already there definitely contributed to what ended up being this fatal fire for 6 Boston firefighters. This building that comes out later on in the investigation, the history and the construction were problematic. This building at this time in 1898 was a mattress factory. They made mattresses in there, so it was full of combustible material. But previous to that, around in the 1860s, just prior to the Civil War, this same building was a church. When it was converted later, no structural changes were made. So they moved heavy equipment and supplies into this building. They didn't make any changes. It also turned out that there were two previous fires in this building, 1861 and 1893, that did significant structural damage. In the investigation, they go through and the paint has been damaged. And their investigation at that time, they're able to determine what fire damage was done in February 1898 and back into 1893. And then they start pulling whatever reports they do have. And it just turns out the city of Boston kept records saying that, yeah, in this particular building, there had been fires. And it turns out that they were significant. The major hazards in this particular fire, they stored flammable materials in the upper floors. They had heavy equipment on the upper floors as well. And with the heavy snow and the ice on the roof, it was estimated at 35 plus tons of ice and water already on the structure. Then when they started lobbing water, obviously it increases the load. And that led to what happened was a collapse, sudden collapse. 6 Boston firefighters killed, a district chief, a captain, and 4 firefighters. The mansard roof, it collapsed as the firefighters were on the roof, and the firefighters fell into the 5th floor. As they arrived, and the reports of this are detailed in the newspaper in a way that we wouldn't appreciate today, very descriptive writing. And they talk about the intense heat and fire and smoke that was just emanating from the structure. Obviously, the first arriving companies, they didn't know the pre-existing structural weaknesses, so they were handling this as best they could. They evaluated, they did their size up, and they determined that it was reasonable to take the actions that they did. They just didn't understand that this building was damaged. They also, I think it's safe to say, they didn't understand how much smoke or how much water and ice had accumulated on the roof already. In the aftermath of this fire, the public responded. They were very generous. They treated them as fallen heroes, and they made the general public contributed to the fallen firefighters' families. It was somewhere around $35,000 in 1898 money. So they were very generous. This one also got very political very early on because it was being played out on the cover of the Boston Globe on a regular basis. At this point, you had Fire Marshal Whitcomb, the first state fire marshal, had a legacy in Boston. He was operating as the state fire marshal in the city of Boston. Politically, the state fire marshal's office was being looked at by Deputy Fire Marshal Shaw coming out of the state police office. And then you had Fire Commissioner John Damrell, who was the chief fire engineer for the city of Boston during the Great Boston Fire. If you know anything about the Great Boston Fire and Chief Damrell, he ends up, after he leaves the Boston Fire Department, to be an engineer. This is his passion. He understands water and hydraulics and building construction. So this is obviously later on. He's getting older, but he's still very vocal. And they get into this very political, very public finger pointing in terms of who was responsible and what the cause of this was and what should be done as a result of this particular fire. So it plays out, and Chief Marshal Whitcomb ends up paying the cost in this politically. He's ousted shortly thereafter for this incident. And in hindsight, one might argue that this was the event that led to his ultimately being ousted. The State Fire Marshal office begins to operate out of the state police shortly after this incident. There were practical changes that were made as a result of this. incident. The state and the city of Boston both changed fire safety codes and building codes. They needed to be inspected and documented on a much more regular basis, and they needed to be evaluated in terms of if there were any previous fires there. All that needed to be documented much more carefully. The weight limits in buildings, the regulations were changed, and they were focused much more on the overall structure with a focus on the prevention of roof collapses.
Para continuar en español, oprima 9. This call may be recorded. If you are experiencing hardship, we can help. We offer payment assistance programs and protection for which you may be eligible. Visit eversource.com/billhelp or ask a representative for more information. Please visit mass211.org to find your local community action agency and apply for financial assistance. Did you know you can also set up a payment plan online? Log into your eversource.com account to quickly set up your plan with the same terms you would.
You got a mic open. Could you mute it, please?
If you prefer to speak to a representative, please stay on the line. I am the new Eversource virtual assistant. How can I help you?
Lower my bill.
You'll need to speak to someone, but currently we are closed and only taking calls related to power outages and gas emergencies. For other inquiries, please call back Monday through Friday 8 a.m. to 6 p.m.
I'll wrap up. So in terms of the this particular fire, it resulted in some changes, a lot more communication between the building officials and the building inspectors and the fire department. This changed things significantly. But also politically, this was a watershed moment. This marked a point for about 35 years where the Office of the State Fire Marshal was no longer operating from, the State Fire Marshal no longer had a background in the fire service as Chief Whitcomb did, but now was an inspector, a detective from the state police. And it stayed that way for about 35 years. And this was just the beginning of that change. I think that's where I'm going to wrap it up and ask if there are any questions. If not, I just want to thank you everyone for their time. This is going to be recorded, so we'll be distributing it, the link for the recording. I'd encourage you to reach out to me if you have any questions. You can reach me at josh.shanley@gmail.com. The book's coming out shortly. I've got a couple other history books coming out. If you have any stories or interesting cases that you like me to look into, I'm very passionate about the research. So thanks for your time. I'm going to look at the chat if anyone has any questions, or if you want to open up your mic, please feel free to do so.
Josh, it's Jeff. That was awesome. Thank you.
Oh, hey, Jeff. How are you, sir?
Good, sir. Thanks for the Zoom meeting. It was awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Oh, and I see the Marshals in. Thank you, sir. Thanks for attending.
Josh, it's Randy. Great job.
Thanks, Randy. Appreciate you. Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what was going on when I first got in here, so it was kind of hard to figure out what was going on. But Daniel Gardner said he's gonna send me the recorded video so I can get a better picture of what's going on.
Awesome. Yeah, Dan's here. He'll get the link out to everyone.
Hi, Dan. Sorry, I'm having him for my professor next year too. It's gonna be awesome.
Happy to have you.
Love having you around too, dude. Thank you.
All right. No more questions, comments. Thanks everyone for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm going to end the meeting.